Welcome to week 3 of War, Revolutions and Terror. In the first week, of course, we set out the basic parameters. The basic parameters of the course. Come on in, there's a couple of strangers. Nice to see you. Okay, so you're welcome to sit in. Okay, that's up to you. So you've pretty well done this before. Okay, that's good. I've got a couple now sitting here. Both of whom sat in the course last year. One's repeating. Okay. So let's just recap what we've done so far. We talked broadly in the first lecture about war and revolution and terror and how they each are part of a circulatory spirit. Not that every war is grounded in revolution or every revolution. Revolution. At least with some exceptions like the Industrial Revolution or the Scientific Revolution, but political revolutions are invariably war is going to come into it at some point, a civil war. Now, I won't recap on all of that. We mentioned some different revolutions. We went into, also we talked about the French Indian Wars at some length, and then the American War of Independence, which was also the American Revolution. We will come back to that a little later, insofar as it was an important spur in terms of aspirations and a certain mindset that had an impact on the on what would become the French Revolution. Then last week we spent a lot of time talking about the wars of religion, and I cannot overestimate how important those wars were. Ultimately, you could say that they bred a new kind of type, a new human type. And this is the enlightened philosopher. And a little later in this lecture, I will go into much more detail about a number of these figures and what was so novel about them, and ultimately the kind of thoughts that they had, which would gain a lot of traction amongst a certain class within the French Revolution, especially the more literate and proactive participants in steering the revolution. What we're going to look at now today is we're going to look at other wars. So what I'm wanting to convey to you is what a long history of violence the French Revolution had. And as we will see, the French Revolution is a very violent affair. But France was a very violent place, and indeed you could say Europe in general was a very violent place. So we're going to look at some other wars that would have long-term consequences, and I repeat a principle that I often say in classes, and that is the solution to something is often the beginning of a new problem. But of course, when that solution is introduced, people don't see the problem because it's ticking away. It hasn't yet manifested what it would be. It seems to be great, that you've solved a problem. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about the wars of the nobles and the parliaments in the 17th century and the advancement of absolute monarchy. Now, one thing I really want you to bear in mind to keep in your head, because one typical way of describing the French Revolution, and it's not that it's not true, but it doesn't really touch the complexities. And that way of describing it is a class revolt against the nobility. It's a class revolt against the nobility and the clergy, or the upper clergy, and the crown, so the leading estates and rulers. But one thing that's really important to bear in mind is how much interclass tension there had been even within the upper echelons of governance, and especially the nobility, between the nobility and the crown, and how that the crown ultimately exercises its authority over the nobility, and then other things that happen within the nobility are ultimately going to create an opportunity for what is called the third estate, and that is the non-nobles, the non-clergy, for them when an opportunity to seize power and overthrow the old order occurs. So the war of the nobles and the nobles against the crown is what I wanted to focus on. Now, one of the things that's really important is that there was a huge expansion of royal offices intendants. They're basically people that govern an area in terms of extracting revenue from it and overseeing the revenue action. Financiers after the religious wars. Now, I'm going to be jumping around a bit in this lecture because there's bits where you have to see a particular thread, and if I do the whole thing chronologically, it all gets too complicated. It's better to go backwards and forwards a bit. So I'll just broadly say that this conflict between the nobles and the crown had a lot to do with the crown seeking money and finding other ways to gain resources which could bypass the nobles. Now, if you're a noble, you don't want to be bypassed. You're basically, I've used this term before, you're offering essentially protection for those group under you, and you rely upon their resources, the food supply they've got, plus other materials they produce, for your own subsistence. So you're in a sense locked in. Now bear this in mind as a general point too. And this is something that's so easily overlooked when people speak abstractly about revolution. The different classes, the different roles they play, they are largely locked in. They don't have an alternative. This is their means of, this is why they get up in the morning and why they're able to go to bed at night and still have something, possibly more, but nevertheless, still feel secure in their being. So the social fabric is this woof and warp of interlocking interests, and interest being, as I said, just what you do, your position in the social order. So more generally, as the crown was trying to bypass the nobles, this weakened the opportunity to get resources. It also weakened the leverage of the parliaments. Now, as you see on the right-hand side here, I point out that the parliaments was a very archaic institution in France. It goes back to Paris, and in some ways it's a hang-on from the importance of tribal councils, but that goes back even further. And then it begins in Paris and spreads to the provinces. Note, it's not a democratic body. It's not a governing body in the way that we understand the term parliament. So it has a very special meaning, and don't confuse this. It's a judicial arrangement. It's an appellate court, and it can approve or not laws and edicts, but there's ways for the king ultimately to bypass that. So they play an important role as kind of discussants of legislation. It's a site where they can articulate their interest, and they do it though through the law. And what we can see in this map in the middle here, if you look closely, is the map of parliaments, and you see them spread throughout the different provinces. The last one there was Nancy in Lorraine in 1776. So that is an important player, and it will be important. So to bear in mind, once we get to the lead up to the French Revolution and the role of Paris within it, but more specifically the role of the Parlement of Paris, we can see that this is a significant body of interests. This weakening of this opportunities for the regional nobilities and the magistrates was ultimately what leads to what is known as the War of the Fronde, which takes place between 1648 and 1653. But as we will also see, there's lots of other sporadic uprisings occurring throughout France in the 17th century. So there's actually two. It breaks into two. First, the Parliament's revolt, and then the nobles' revolt. Now, there's also a tension going on. I'll speak about this a little more at length later. It's one of these examples of me jumping around, between what's called the nobles of the robe, who are essentially the new kids on the block, who are basically moving into more magisterial type of positions, and the nobles of the sword. And again, you'll recall me saying that initially political power comes from military capacity. It's and indeed achievement, because you're a protector. But they're allied in the frond. The frond just is a French word for basically slingshot, the shot. So it's not necessarily a region. We'll see a little later. I'll show you a map of where the wars primarily occurred, and here it is. I'm showing you right here. So you can see these different provinces and areas, which includes Paris, Marseille, great port town, Bordeaux, and just north of Paris. So this is where the epicenter of the crisis is, of these revolts that are happening in France. Now, the central, I said they needed money, and the question of who pays for wars and building up an army, that's going to be very important. France is starting to want to be a major player, and it has to be paid for. That is a major geopolitical power, and it's becoming that. But this has to be paid for. So there's a big issue around taxation. And again, you might recall from the very first lecture I gave where I said taxation and extraction, they are often exactly what you have to look at when you're seeing social discontent and revolt. And for many of you that are young, you know, that are just doing university, and in fact, in a country like Australia, tax is just taken out of your pay, so it doesn't seem to be a big issue. But when tax is actually so bound up with your livelihood, and when it means that you do so much and it's immediately taken from you, not in a centralized, coordinated, almost tacit way as it occurs today. So in a sense, you don't really notice it. You just think in terms of, oh well, that's my net pay, and the gross pay doesn't really matter. That's a great solution to the problem of getting taxation, and it's an indication of the way in which modern administrative systems of the state have been so well coordinated and so centralized. But what we're going to see in France is that lack of centralization, that lack of coordination, financial centralization coordination, is a massive, massive problem. But the problem occurs because of the way in which the country has developed, how it's built up over time, the practices, the regional practices, the dependencies, the way those dependencies are paid for, so that centralization, which we think is the most natural thing in the world, is a very hard thing to achieve. And France, and much of the story is of leading up to and even beyond the French Revolution, is about how, well, certainly up to the French Revolution, is about how to try and centralize a process to make sure that the show can go on. Now, under Louis XIII, Louis XIII was a child, and Cardinal Richelieu, who was a very important historical figure, had attempted to centralize the French state. So he was imposing direct taxes on powerful provinces, and hence the number of officers being appointed at local government to get hold of the money really started to increase. At the same time, the Estates General, that is a forum in which people could articulate their interests, this would not meet until 1614. I'll come back to that. But the lack of a forum for the groups to articulate their interest is ultimately going to be very problematic. Because if you've got no place to express what you need, the sword becomes much more readily accessible, and you're much more ready to go to it, because there just seems to be no other alternative. Louis XIV was also a child when he took the throne. And of course, how is it that a child can be ruler? Because it's a dynastic system. It's the family that matters. It's the heritage. It's the blood that matters. And that too is a dynastic means of succession as a way of ensuring political stability, though it generates all sorts of instabilities, but that is such a common historical experience that goes way back to the ancient world, goes back to the earliest empires, and there's lots of contestations between families and around dynasties, and hence the importance of interdynastic marriages between territories. So Cardinal Mazarin had become the chief of state after Richelieu, and again he had essentially the same program: we must centralize. And at the same time they're wanting to centralize because the crown is absolutizing itself. It's becoming more and more central, but its power as a centralizing power and as a more absolutist power, it's taking more privileges away from the nobles. Now again, when you think at the time of the French Revolution, and the typical narrative is, well, the nobles, you know, they've got so much and the rest of the people have so little. Well, again, that's partly true, but you have to see in the context of when stuff is being pulled away from the nobles, and again the reaction to this. And the same was going on with the parliaments losing authority. So this is from Charles Tilly, and I'll just quickly read this out. So the reason I give you indicate this is that the War of the Fronde, which is a kind of high point, and if you do a chronology, you go to the War of the Fronde as part of French history. It's a very important aspect of French history, or thing that happens in French history. But as Tilly points out, there had been all sorts of popular revolts and great rebellions that were occurring with remarkable frequency in France, the Ile-de-France, Languedoc, Burgundy, and Anjou, so these different regions. And he lists a whole number. I won't read them all out, but you can see that they're partly religious, they're partly an uprising against the merchants, there's a rebellion against the tax farmers, a rebellion against the establishment of election, there's a rebellion against certain taxes, so leading up to, and then the Fronde. So there's been these sporadic uprisings that have, you know, indicate just how violent France was. And another way of putting this is how ineffective any kind of centralized legal system was in France, that it was still essentially regional, but wars were being sporadically occurring as people were seeking their different interests. Now the peacetime army, now remember, because of these, it's not only geopolitical reasons, and that's an important component of why the French crown wants its army, but it's also because of these kind of uprisings. So the attempt to increase the size of the army, the scale of the army, and it increases 10 times between the time of Henry IV and Louis XIV. It increases 10 times. That's a massive increase. That's just a peacetime army, but needed because of these sporadic uprisings. Also, what this does is, because the army, the important officers in the army, they're nobles. So because the army is increasing, this gives a great opportunity for nobles who may have been members of noble families, but to increase their participation in the army. It's like it's typical law of economics. Supply creates demand, and the demand certainly came. So this opened up all these military career opportunities, but it wasn't as if you were in the army, you just stayed in the army. So you may become an officer now in the army, and this is happening parallel with all these other ways of joining the nobility. So you come in, you get your designation as a noble, but then that carries on after you're no longer even serving in the army. So they would maintain their commission. So what does being a noble mean? And I'll come back to this, but it basically is an opportunity to get resources for those under your commission. So you've got to pass on commission, but those underneath you have to give commission. But as I've said, the king wants to bypass this problem. So he's sending out all these other royal officers to get the commission. So you're competing for resources. And of course, the poor buggers at the bottom, they've got no one else to compete with. So this increases the number of the new nobles, or the nobles of the robes, essentially magisterial positions. Now, after the Fronde, so I'll go there and then we'll go back to the Fronde. But Louis had has higher nobles. He has to quell this. So what does he do? He decides, okay, we'll bring you in from your areas and you spend time at court. And what do you do at court? Well, you cultivate manners. You hang out. You enjoy the good life. You become spoilt and sumptuous. And that's exactly what's going on. And there's, you know, all sorts of literature that deals with this. There's and many literati come out of the nobles as well. They get their material from the fact that they're able to have such leisure, sit around at court, and enjoy the high life. Though I should say something about the high life. There's a story of I can't remember who it was, but some noble woman in America during the American Revolution, and a number of nobles, as we'll see, they were really attracted to what was going on in the United States, or what would become the United States. And she's in someone's carriage, and they're driving past a slaughterhouse, and the driver says, "Hold your nose, this is really stinking." And she said, "Well, it doesn't smell any worse than Versailles." So what that's basically, you don't have sewerage. People aren't that conscious of hygiene. So although they're living in all, and they're powdering themselves and putting wigs all over them and to try and hide the stench. So when he brings all the nobles in as well, there's a lot of hostility to the crown and to this class of people from the Parisians, because they are the most burdened by tax as well. So the king decides to move to Versailles. Now that's going to play a big part in the story, because what will happen during the French Revolution is when the March of Women go to Versailles and they bring the king back. And this is the beginning of the king being imprisoned, even though at this stage he's ostensibly free because he gives so much power away by becoming a constitutional monarch. But that's really the beginning of his imprisonment and subsequent death. So this move to Versailles, so it is symptomatic of these big tensions between the crown and the people of Paris. And Paris is, of course, demographically the strongest region in France. And it will really be the epicenter of the revolution, even though there's other important regional centers. The urban-rural divide is going to be very important. So as I said, their functions change. And as they change, those people that are giving their taxes away think, well, what the hell are, paying high taxes, which is essentially just a straight extraction from their immediate labor. What the hell are you doing for me? You're not protecting me anymore. In fact, I don't need you. I've got the army, and they've got to be paid for as well. You're just a bloodsucker. That's the kind of mentality that will form. Now, I'll go back to Tilly. I think he makes a really good point here. The central facts to grasp are first, so this is about the violence too, that's running all in parallel with this. The intermittent action of several distinct groups, the members of the high courts, Parisian rentiers, great nobles, residents of major cities, and others, who had seen the war-making growth of royal power attacking their autonomy, rights, and welfare. That's the key point I've been making. Second, the making and breaking of temporary coalitions amongst different sets of those aggrieved party. That's exactly how the War of the Fronde moves from being a war of the Parliament, an uprising of the Parliament, and then they align themselves with the nobles. And so, again, the distinction starts to blur. They see themselves as a common set of interests. Now, it's also true that it wasn't that the rebellions just simply stopped because we periodise the War of the Fronde. There were various other sporadic uprisings until he lists all of these here up until earlier the 18th century. So what we've got, increase in new nobles, the nobles of the robe, and the line between the new and old nobles is blurred. This creates resentment from the old nobles. The old nobles are there. Look, we put our lives on the line. Our families have provided all this protection. We've sacrificed ourselves, and you just come in as magistrates, and you want the same stuff we've got. Didn't like it. So there's a tension, an interclass tension. Nobility could also be purchased, called venal offices. And basically what that meant is you purchased an office. So this is a way of the crown raising revenue, right? You give the crown money. And giving the crown money, you then have carte blanche in certain areas to go and get money. And there's no necessary correlation between what you give the crown and what you can usurp yourself, or what you can extract yourself. So they say, we want so much money for this office, and then you try and get that, and every other penny you can get your hand on. Again, what you're seeing is the failure of a lack of coordination and centralization in a meaningful way for the financial system. But there were also increasing numbers, not huge numbers, but increasing numbers of very wealthy people, whether it's through an agricultural base or merchant base, doesn't really matter, who were so wealthy that they became de facto like nobles. And they would then simply by their sheer presence be in the position of able to offer people things which they would then pay for. So again, they get in the racket. It's just racket upon racket upon racket, really. Then there was also the fact that some of the older nobles, they're starting to go broke because all these other people are competing for the scarce resources that the resource base is able to generate. And remember, this is agrarian, primarily agrarian society, artisans and merchants, much smaller group, primarily. So the amount of wealth that is being generated is very limited. And I don't know if I said this last week or the week before, but this is something to always bear in mind. If you look at GDP growth rates over the last couple of thousand years, and there's economists have done all sorts of guesstimates to try and do this, what you basically see is a flat line up until about the 18th century. Then there's a bit of a leap, and things like banking and trading, largely through banking, capital loans, etc., have been able to, the expanse of the regions where trade can take place, incipient globalization, if one will. This all is starting to boost things, but it's not really until you've got the Industrial Revolution that things just go crazy. And they go even crazier once you've got oil. Once you've got an energy system that can just provide, ongoing mechanization, electrification, and everything. That is the game changer. So anyway, coming back to intermarriage was quite common. Nobles had a daughter. Let's marry her off to someone who's got some money and but also got a title. So old noble is trading in on the wealth of the new noble. But there's a lot of resentment going on. They don't really like it. And this is all brought out in Molière's very famous play. At the time, it was a huge success. The bourgeois gentilhomme. So here we're seeing the word bourgeois. That's going to come up throughout the course because it'll become a core term within Marxism. But when Marx uses the term, a different meaning is being foisted on it than at this time, and indeed throughout the entirety of the French Revolution. The term bourgeois comes from the word burg, means a city dweller. So in the first instance, though, this bourgeois gentilhomme is someone who's managed to buy an office, who's really a bourgeois and not a gentilhomme, but he spends his day trying to emulate what the aristocrats do. So, and Molière has a very good eye for what's going on at court. So this is almost like this is kind of new kid on the block is pretending to be cultivated and well-mannered. He has his music lessons and he's reading his poetry, etc. It's a farce. It's a comedy. And it's a send-up. And it's the kind of send-up which the old nobility just love. They just love this. But it is true that this new type is spearheading, unwittingly so, but a new phase of modernization of the political and social system. Now, Paris's importance, which we'll keep coming back to Paris, was a center of the mind and commerce. So ideas matter. The ideas matter. They're not the only thing that matters, and I can't emphasize this enough. Possibly the best work in more recent times, though there's many works that do this, but Jonathan Israel has written a number of very, very large tomes. And he essentially argues the case that the ideas were the most important thing. And he gives it a very good run for his money. And he's a very good scholar of the period. But ultimately, a lot of historians remain unconvinced. Because the ideas need a context. They need flesh in which to take hold. And the social structures, which I'll be looking at, are also the flesh. Obviously, the other thing is going to matter. It's not something I overly emphasize throughout the course, but at different times it does come into play. And that's just simply the personalities, the raw character of someone within a context that may be able to make a huge difference. If you think of the importance of character affecting a world, I can think of no better example than Henry VIII. I always use this example because had Henry VIII not been so lusty and avaricious, he would never have broken with Rome. Had he not broken with Rome, or let me put this another way, had he broken with Rome and decided to throw his lot in with the reformers, the civil war would never have occurred. In all likelihood, there would have been no reason for the civil war in the United Kingdom. But because he fanned off as a bit of a theologian, because he didn't like what the reformers do, so because he was a bit of a big head in a sense, and Henry VIII had actually received some medallion from the Pope before the breach about his scholastic theological skills and interventions. But there we see a personality, wanting a divorce, chasing women, man of large appetites, wanting property, needing taxation, usurping essentially Roman land, church land. This has a huge effect. Now, I don't think in the French Revolution, to some extent, not quite like the Russian Revolution. I think the Russian Revolution, so I'm signaling this, the Russian Revolution, the particular personality of Lenin, ultimately, I think, is going to be very, very important in the siege of power by the Bolsheviks, because basically he pushes forward a tactic that others in the party weren't looking at. And the same might even be true of Stalin. His personality is really important. Within the French Revolution, I don't think there's anyone. The most common figure is the most widely known figure that gets associated with the French Revolution will be Robespierre. But on closer scrutiny, you have to see, well, Robespierre has a very brief moment in the sun, and it's well after the revolution has started. So it's very different. And the other thing we'll notice about the French Revolution is a whole array of significant personalities. Some win, get beheaded, have short-lived victories, and then they're done with, and then they disappear from the picture. So, coming back to, ideas, personalities, these all matter, but it was a commercial centre. In the front, the Parliament had really suffered in the wars, and had rendered it politically powerless. So, while And you also remember all the stuff about the Huguenots from last week. So they'd been expelled, but many of them returned to Paris. The king, if you recall, has put his lot in with the Jesuits, absolutely hated. So all this stuff is brewing away that's both anti-monarchical and anti-clerical, and ultimately will be anti-noble as well. You could say that the French Revolution is ultimately the revenge of Paris. I think there's something in that. Now, I mentioned that the last meeting of the Estates General was before the War of the Fronde. It occurred in 1614. The Estates General represented the three estates, the three primary classes: clergy, nobles, commoners. They had evolved out of the King's Council. It did only meet sporadically, but why it closed down in 1614 was symptomatic of the fact that the different class interests, or the different classes, sorry, had very different interests. So the clergy had wanted the acceptance of the decrees of the Council of Trent, and they were basically trying to protect their tax privilege. The nobles wanted to reassert their feudal, honorary, and official privileges, and remember, that's exactly what the War of the Fronde is going to be, a continuation of this grievance. And the third estate, even back then in 1614, where you've got far less urban professionals at this stage, wanted to assert the independence of France, hold the nobles in check, control local government, and spread, and this is the optimum thing, spread the tax burden. The conflict between, especially the first and third estates, was such that they never really got ameliorated. They would never be ameliorated. So in the main, the nobles and the clergy are sort of backing each other up, even though they've got some squabbles within themselves over who gets what. But the big losers at this time are the third estate. And look, again, you've got to bear in mind, this goes back to something I emphasized last week as well, that the fundamental basis of any state formation, of any pre-modern society. And so we see, so what we're really seeing here is a confirmation of the kind of system you had back in ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, and that is rulers, army, priests. Why are priests important? They preside over all the bits of social glue where people need to worship the same gods, cultivate the same essential sediments around the same kind of stories which are deemed sacred, and engage in a common set of rituals. These are really important. So that the priests have this power is not because they were politically unimportant. By the time of the French Revolution, they're seen as politically unimportant. In part, that's because of a rabid animosity that has occurred in France due to the failure to really reform the church. Now, that again, you will recall that France didn't so much need to reform the church insofar as it already, the crown was able to extract revenue from them, some revenue, but in their importance, they weren't paying, ultimately they weren't paying that much revenue. But there was a way of basically, the Gallic Christianity was a way of bypassing the importance of Rome. So there was a kind of independence that was there that was very different to what was happening in northern Germany, which was why the princes of northern Germany supported Luther and the reformers. And then, as we said, that starts to spread. So priests, one lot, the other lot, the warriors, which are the nobles. But as we've said, now there's been a fracture in the warrior class by setting up this essentially a professional, a kind of, or a more centralized army in which the nobles are being played off against each other. So all of what was going on was the absolutization of the French crown. And France was not alone in this. There were movements in that direction, and successful movements in that direction in both Spain and in the United Kingdom. So this centralizing tendency, in a sense, makes a lot of sense because of the scale of coordination that you need in order to have the scale of army that you need. So again, territorial success also means creation of a problem, because you need to provide the manpower to protect that territory, and then the manpower to protect the revenue streams and so on. So at this stage, the divine right of kings, which was a relatively new doctrine, becomes the centerpiece of the self-understanding of the crown. And there's a very famous and very, very smart political theorist called Jean Baudin, who writes this great book defending this doctrine of the divine right of kings. So the divine right of kings ultimately is a reinvigoration, but ultimately a reconfiguration of what had been a traditional Christian doctrine. And the traditional Christian doctrine was that the Christian crown had to show its loyalty to the church. And in showing that loyalty to the church, the Christian subjects would show their loyalty to the crown. So the disjuncture, or the division between crown and church, was such that it was seen, and we find even even in Paul, when he's even talking about leaders that aren't Christian, but this becomes intensified under Christianity in the understanding of state and the conferral of power by the church. The church is absolutely central at the coronation of any king. So they're in the mix. But where Paul just says, look, subjects, you have to give due obedience to the crown. Now, in the Middle Ages, there will be all sorts of disputes about what happens, as was happening, is when there's a big conflict between church and crown. Who do you owe your ultimate allegiance to? And a number of them said, well, in this case, you might even have a right to rebel. Thomas Aquinas, in his great work, Summa Theologica, juggles around with this. It basically says you can, but you shouldn't. That's essentially his position. So the crown now is seeing itself as the all-important political power, that it's got a direct line to God. Got a direct line to God. Not even though it's Catholic, it's not a direct line to Rome, because it doesn't really care about Rome. It's a relatively independent church. Now, there's going to be problems with this. First of all, one person can't run a state. Whether you're Hitler, Mussolini, or poor old Louis the 16th, who I think really was poor old Louis. I think he's a really tragic figure. I don't think Louis could have done anything, just as I don't think the Russian Tsar could have done anything, Nicholas II could have done anything at the moment in which they called upon, except possibly be so ruthless. That might have saved them. A degree of ruthlessness on a scale that was ultimately unimaginable to those people themselves. So you need all these dependents, and it's because you're reliant, because your very institution, your role in the social fabric, what you do, is so bound up with your dependents that you can't simply make them give their power away without you'd be resorting back to the war of the Fronde. Now, this is going to be very important, because ultimately this is one of the things that's happening when there's ultimately the tennis court oath, and when there's the setting up of the National Assembly. It's a setting up of the National Assembly because these very vested interests won't play ball. And the crown can't really make them play ball because he's totally dependent on him. They're the first lot he's dependent on. But he's also discovering that everybody else is dependent upon the third estate. So you're absolutely absolutely torn this way and that way. And you've got the War of the Fronde. You know the story of what happens if you get the nobles offside. So it's not just caprice that makes the crown unable to really move, which is to say, de facto accepting what the nobles want. It's not caprice. It's not even, you know, simple choice. There's no choice. There's really no choice there. So you've got the three pillars of the throne, and I think Rosenstock-Huessy, you know, is very prescient when he says that the really fundamental thing about the French Revolution is that it's anti-clerical, anti-dynastic, and anti-noble. Anti-clerical, anti-dynastic, and anti-noble. You can see, if you do that, there's nothing of the old order left. Now, I'll just come back to the English Revolution and the French Revolution. We'll recall that the French Revolution, the English Revolution had briefly created a republic. But the scale, and then a constitutional monarchy. But the scale was nothing like what would happen in the French Revolution. And I think I also mentioned this. Although the English crown was in some ways beholden in Parliament, they weren't completely curtailed by Parliament. Now, when we think of a constitutional monarchy, we basically think of a purely symbolic figure. But this was a long way from the case in Great Britain, even at the time of the American War of Independence. So at the time of the French Revolution. This would eventually, only through the 19th century, would the British Parliament take on all the roles and functions and significance that it does in the 19th, that it has now. It's really, there's aspects of it, but it's not fulfilled. Now, the American Revolution, as we said, began as a war of independence. The victory didn't completely change the social base, but it didn't need to, because the social base in the New World was nothing like the Old World. And the revolutionaries weren't trying to say, in America, they weren't trying to say change any great social base, because there was none to change. They were preserving the freedoms that they already had, and that they believed were being whittled away from them. Of course, as we recall, being whittled away from them because the English crown needed the money to pay for the war it had got involved in to protect them from the French. And now the French then side with the American cause, with the patriotic cause against the British. Now, one thing, and this Simon Sharma, who's got a really great book on I'm rereading it. I read it many years ago. I looked into it many years ago, and now I'm reading it again. And it's such a well-written book. He was very young when he wrote it. It's called Citizens, and it's a great read. I won't say it's by no means the best structural analysis, but in terms of bringing together events and personalities, it's a real corker of a read. And if you're looking for a book to do your book review on, then it's highly recommended. It's pretty long, but it's really great, and it's a ripping yarn. So he points out that there had been a real educational fascination. So, you know, you've got growing literacy at this time. And, you know, if you went back a century beforehand, okay, 2 centuries, but that's not that long really, you would find that many of the nobles weren't even literate. So with the intensification of literacy, with education being more important, again, remember the nobles, they're hanging out at court, repartee, with, you know, theatre, the arts, all of this is surrounding them, and novels are starting to circulate widely, and the philosophers are writing, and again, the philosophers are eagerly read early on by the nobles. They don't see that they're reading their own death act. essentially. Because at that stage, that's not really what the enlightened philosophers were about. They weren't really, they hadn't got that far ahead of the game. But there was this fascination with patriotism, and a core part of the curriculum was Roman history, and Roman history, military history, patriotism is the central thematic, you could say, throughout the story. Also the breakdown of the empire, it's about the breakdown of the empire, and then what happens because the empire is broken down, and all the great heroes of Roman history ultimately going to be those that are patriots and support the republic. So this is already fostering in the intelligence amongst the intellectuals a kind of sympathy, a broad-based sympathy for a republic. And this is exactly what the United States became, or was, after the American War of Independence, or throughout the American War of Independence. And you recall, it wasn't really a democracy so much as a republic. There we have it, that great Roman word, respublica, thing of the people. So a lot of nobles in some way or other, and other wealthy people, were really interested in the American cause. You remember me talking somewhat at length about Beaumarchais' role in this, and Lafayette. Lafayette would be a really important player in the in the French Revolution, but he was also an important player in the American Revolution. We'll talk about Lafayette later in terms of the French Revolution, but in America, he'd been a kind of like a son to George Washington, and he looked upon George Washington as a father-like figure, and he was very young, and he was greeted as a great hero when he came back from France. Here was someone displaying what it is to be a patriot. But see, the French nobility, no, we've got nothing to be patriotic about. And I think amongst the more enlightened philosophers, nobles, this kind of narrative, this kind of way of viewing things started to take root. Because there's a big question to be asked, and it's this: why were a number of quite prominent nobles drawn to the revolutionary cause, including a guy called Philip Égalité, who was a relation of who was a relative. I can't remember, what was he, a cousin or half brother even of the king, something like that. But he threw his lot in with the revolutionary cause. You know, on paper it makes no sense, but in actuality, Mirabeau also was a noble. He was one of the newcomer nobles, and he was a complete scoundrel. He'll come up again later. But nevertheless, there was symptomatic of it. Well, we'll talk about Clootz a bit later. He was a Prussian noble, so who ended up in France. It was a rabid Jacobin, radical left-winger, so to speak, if we're to use that nomenclature, which I'll go into a bit later because it does come from the revolution. The other thing was that, just as with the Roman republicans, the word liberty was all important. It was this word that had a resounding, triggering, patriotic effect in the American Revolution. So the word liberty had a ring to it and a sound to it, a depth to it. It was something ultimately that people could die for. Now, I think people all too frequently downplay the significance of meaning, to the extent even of ultimate meaning, the part that plays in people's lives. And our more modern society is very materially, functionally based. Welfare, health, you know, the state should be spending more on education and health. You know, that's claim being made. And education, in my lifetime, I've seen it just move from something that was often valued as providing a kind of potential wisdom in the greater community, now something that only matters is skill-based and transferable in a immediate profession that can earn money. But at the same time as that happens, with all the moral narratives and the significance the that they have taken on in our society, I think it's exactly a confirmation of this very idea that meaning matters, that meaning really matters. Invariably, people will want their meaning or their role as dispersers of the importance of meaning or controllers of the importance of meaning. They want to be paid for it. There will always be a material component of it. But nevertheless, and the reason I say this is because just as this anti-clericism is spreading, we're starting to see, or what we're witnessing, is that the vacuum that's left by, in a sense, the old God, or the disappearance of that old spiritual order, it's being replaced by a new spiritual hierarchy in which ideas such as liberty start to play a central role. And equality will then also come into the mix, as will fraternity, the three great catchwords of the French Revolution. Now, as we go further into it, the other thing to mention is that there's a number of stages to the French Revolution, so you can tell the story chronologically. But the logic of those stages was largely due to different transformations that were taking place in which no one was seeing the outcome of it. So, to put it bluntly, we use the term French Revolution, but that becomes the term that's used rather retrospectively after a kind of continuity of sporadic outbreaks, and very different hostilities tend to get coordinated within one process. But initially, they seem to be disconnected. And this is again, this is the way we do reality. When we act in defiance of something, usually it's something that immediately concerns us, that pushes us into action. It's not just an abstraction, even though abstractions may then help foster that. But in the first instance, it's something as basic as people squabbling over toilet paper in Woolworths through the virus and the shortage. So we will see this, how these different discontents and outbreaks will coalesce. What we have, though, is a social breakdown. That is ultimately what is, I think, the one thing that becomes the revolution, that you can call it a revolution. It's the scale of the social breakdown, but there's very diverse objectives. Some simply want bread or prices on the grain. The people that are growing the grain, they don't really like that, so they're not going to have the same kind of interest necessarily, and frequently not, as those in the city. Many will just want to eliminate a tax, and it may be a tax by the nobles or the tithe by the church, but they're very happy to get that. But ultimately, the revolution is made, and this is where Jonathan Israel does have a point, is made and sealed and steered, or I should say steered. There's an opportunity, but it becomes a manufactured object, so to speak. I'm using an analogy here, obviously, in the hands and mouths of those who earn their living ultimately by speaking. People who speak, who give it meaning. And this is why I'll say it, and I'll say it a number of times. One of the things that comes out of the French Revolution is the absolute displacement of the first estate, that is the clergy, by the intelligentsia and ideas brokers. I'll come back to that point, but ultimately it's very important. So, ideas and parties. Parties, participants, but participants is group. So what were the ideas that drove it? Who were the party social groups? Driving ideas, yes, I've said, very important, especially for those that want to steer it. But what we will always see is the idea and the reality never match up. They ultimately, and this is something very important to keep in mind about the French Revolution as opposed to the Russian Revolution. In the Russian Revolution, revolutionary group before the revolution. So you have a driving idea right at the beginning of it, and that group is bound around that idea, though there's contestations around the idea and exactly how it'll play out. But in France, you don't really have any idea till it's taking place. You've got a whole bunch of abstract ideas, liberty, equality, they're being banded around. But exactly what that will mean, you haven't really mapped that out yet. And the mapping is changing every day as the revolution is changing, which is another reason why to exactly identify what's the moment of the revolution is not such an easy thing. Historians, you know, to make it easy, we put together from 1989 to, and then it gets more complicated. Do you end it at the overthrow of the Jacobins? Do you end it at the overthrow of Napoleon, or do you end it at the overthrow of the Directory and the coming to power of Napoleon as a dictator, or do you end it in, you know, at the end of Napoleon's defeat? Is that really the end of it? Francois Furet, really great writer on the revolution, often called a revisionist historian because he came out of the Marxist tradition, and then I'll go into this a bit later, but then shows, I think, pretty convincingly why that tradition is just unsustainable, why that narrative around the revolution just does not hold water. He goes right up until 1881. Thinks, you know, that's the arc. Well, you could say it's never stopped. That's another way of looking at it, because the influence of it through decolonialization and setting up of nationalism, etc. The Kurds still want to build a nation state. You know, one of the few, apart from the Palestinians in the Middle Eastern area. You could say they're still the spawn of the French Revolution. So there's a degree. Historians are always being somewhat arbitrary when they classify things. You talk about arbitrary, just try and get people to settle on what the Middle Ages is. That's a very good example of that. And some people will go, oh, well, it's up until 1300 from 400 and something, or maybe it's 380 to 15 something, or 16 something. And you say, well, be careful with these terms, okay? And that's, in a sense, the term revolution itself. So certainly, social conditions, as I said, are important. But one of the aspects of to understand the revolution through the ideas, one of the reasons why that is important and not 100% wrong, and this is really what attracts Jonathan Israel to it, is that if it's an idea, then as long as the idea persists, that legacy is persisting. So if the ideas are in narrative, then that is still very much alive. And because of that, then, the ideas serve as a kind of model. And it is true that later generations would often take the French Revolution as a kind of model, which is why historians were so divided about its meaning, because in their head, they would very often be thinking of what can it still do, what has it done, where has it exhausted itself, and with the Marxists, what usurped the role that the French Revolution did, what, in a sense, they passed on the baton. Now we've got a better model. So we had this model, and now we have this model, and we want to transfer these models globally. See, this is the way the intelligentsia works. It tends to think in terms of model imposition. There are some members of the intelligentsia, and I put myself amongst this rather narrow group, much smaller group, who think, no, we're just trying to understand things. And just trying to understand things, we're not looking at some great purpose that comes out of this. We'll always see some victories and some losses and some perennial problems. So I make no apologies for thinking like this, because I think if you think in terms of models, you inevitably oversimplify what the revolution, what made it happen, and what came out of it, what its meaning was. I think you simplify, and you therefore think it's something that you can take from there and put over here, when in fact, looking at the grain of the details of what make it happen, as we can just see how many contingencies, how many things, you know, like going back to the War of the Fronde, or the fact, or the St. Bartholomew's massacre, or the Huguenots gravitating to where they did and how they were treated, etc. All of these things makes it happen. The special condition of the clergy in France, the special reasons why the clergy were hated so much more in France than anywhere else. You know, all of these things feed into the kind of revolution it was. Now, I'm going to talk about the Enlightenment for a while. It can be called the revolution of philosophism. And there's something wrong?
You have 2 messages.
Sorry?
You have 2 messages first.
Oh, no, they're old messages. They were done before. So, a revolution of philosophism. That term was used by Thomas Carlyle. And that's the term he uses to describe in his very poetic and vigorously written book on the French Revolution. It's kind of, it's written in a frenzy, or it seems like a frenzy. Sort of, it's great. It's like his mind is like a camera, and you're just zooming here and there, and you get a sense of the tumult and the energy. And then he coins this term because he sees the ideas as playing such an important part, but he's also seeing the individual characters and the movements and the events. So that's brilliant. So, philosophy, where does this figure in? Now, we've got to recall something I said last week, is that a new type of person, that is a non-religiously affiliated philosopher, emerges out of the religious wars. And Descartes is the beginning of that. And this type of person, they're trying to understand the whole world. That's their brief. Descartes writes a book, he didn't publish it in his lifetime, it's called The World. Now, in trying to understand the world, that means they have to observe the laws of the world. And Descartes will argue, and although his particular argument is lots of the details are not accepted by other members of that type, nevertheless, the big picture thing of you need to know everything, you need to know nature, you need to know the laws of nature, and ultimately we need to find a way in which this whole, this all, is seen as perpetually ongoing in a law-like manner. And this will also mean that the kind of ways that people previously have spoken about the world essentially is nuts. From their perspective, it's nuts. It's just bad. It's the product of, the phrase will be used, one of Descartes' heirs, student, so to speak, was a philosopher called Malebranche. And he makes a really big thing about the fevered nature of the imagination. So the fevered imagination, and the imagination has to be quelled by being subordinate to what's called the understanding. So we try to understand nature's laws. How do we understand nature's laws? Well, to come up with some principles that we can test with our reason and observation. And we draw up models. We draw up these little models to do the testing. So your imagination then is going into model building. And this takes off like wildfire. The other thing that takes off, because now you don't have to be beholden to the church. And remember, there's been a Reformation. This has opened up. This has opened up prospects for this kind of independent thinker about the world. But this also leads to a very different conception of God, and it's called deism. This idea also circulates in some also anti-denominational practices amongst professions, such as the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians. So there also attempts to provide a spiritual understanding, so-called spiritual understanding of the world, to make sense of the world and to make sense of God that is very non-denominational because of what the religious wars have done. They're reactions to the religious wars. And these philosophers, and all the great philosophers of the Enlightenment, will be deists. Baruch Spinoza will be a pantheist, everything is God, but at the end of the day, that makes no difference. That's such a minute difference to anyone but the philosophers. Just keep this in mind. And the significance of this is the idea is of God as a creator that puts the laws into existence and then doesn't interfere in any way that violates his laws. So what's that mean? No miracles. But the miracle is the basis, not only of Christian teachings in Christendom. You cannot understand what happened in Europe unless you realize how widespread belief in miracles was. If, for example, you read, I've forgotten his name just for a moment, it's just hit my mind, but the ecclesiastical, Bede, who writes of Alfred the Great. If you read Bede, the overwhelming thing that's being told, and it's basically, this is the story of the unification, to the extent it was unified, of Alfred against the Norse and the Danes and other intruders on English soil, and basically finding other groups to bond with him. It's a fantastic story. There's a fictional account of it by a guy called Bernard Cornwell. A couple of episodes have appeared on television. It's kind of good, but of course the fictional telling plays havoc with especially the more religious elements, because Cornwell really hates Christianity, and that so the telling of the tale is marred somewhat from the way. But when you go back and read Bede, you see one of the reasons these groups come together is because against impossible odds they have victories, and this is a confirmation of their church commitment. This is a confirmation of their kind of Christianity, and there were basically two types of Christianity, even in England at this stage, a kind of afterhang of a split within the church around the teachings of Arius that go way back to the 3rd, 4th century. But I don't want to go too far into that. I simply want to underscore that the role of miracle was important in nation building. And these new philosophers, miracle is just superstitious. That's what they're saying. The miracle is superstitious. And many, Descartes, for example, was attacked by many clerics. But a number of other clerics believed that the only way to salvage the church, and remember the church is an economic prospect as much as anything, the only way to salvage spiritual but material conditions, the only way to salvage it is to speak of God in this more philosophical way, which is to say the whole use of the figurative imagination, all the stories involving persons and miracles, has no place in this. Deism is impersonal, which means it's not really Christian. You can take certain surface bits of Christianity, but what does communion mean in this sense? What does even saying your prayers mean? Why would your prayers be listened to? You don't have a relationship with God. God is not the kind of entity that you can have a relationship with. So this is a massive transfer amongst a small group of people, but this small group of people, their narratives, through also what's happening with the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians, are gaining more and more currency. And again, just to underscore it again, people are so sick of what religion's done because of all the wars. So, people often say religions are the cause of all wars. Well, that's absolute nonsense, because the 20th century, the wars weren't religious. But it is true that you may very well think like that at a certain part of the 16th and 17th century, though you'd quickly learn, oh yeah, but then there's a war to Front. That doesn't really fit that. But nevertheless, it's a factor. So what people like Descartes are arguing is there is a natural light of reason, and if we can but access this, if we can oversee the dangerous fire-like qualities of the imagination, panic-like qualities of the imagination, just see God as occupying a metaphysical role, and of course then eventually we'll say, well, why do we need that? We don't really need him. but it's a metaphysical role. This is what explains things. This will improve the human condition, and this is what Descartes wanted to do. He wanted to improve the human condition. So, and that could only be done if you overthrew existing views about nature, which ultimately had come back into Europe. They were ideas taken from Aristotle that were developed in the 4th century before Christ, and were seen as ultimately, and they were not helpful. There were all sorts of, I won't go into it, it's just too complex. I do go into this kind of thing in my other course on political ideas. But there were ideas in Aristotle that mitigated against seeing all of nature as one system of causation, which is what one thing causes another, causes another, causes another. There's different layers of reality, depths of reality. And Aristotle, not Aristotle, Descartes believed everything had to impact upon everything else. That would be a source of disputation between him and the Newtonians, who pointed out that there was gravity, which meant things could act upon each other at a distance without any intermediary. And that was seen as a metaphysical monstrosity, but ultimately Newton just held up his hands and said, well, that's the way I got for you. That's I just deal in the hypothesis. I don't have to understand. But they're certainly reacting. So they're reacting against the dominance Aristotle's thinking in the university, which didn't only extend to physics, but extended to logic being one of the most important disciplines at the university this time. There's a big reaction against that as well. Now, what then takes off in the Enlightenment? And Descartes has a few suggestions which foster this, but he himself ultimately says, I'm going to stay clear of talking about the society. But he does throw out things like, before someone can enter a new house, they have to live somewhere, and that has to be the old house. So basically, I've got to live in this old world. I've got to live in the world which is not being made through anything other than custom. So I've got to go along with custom. And being born a Catholic, I will go along with the customs of my church. But there are some scholars, and I vehemently disagree with them, I just think they're totally wrong, who see Descartes as a Catholic. And later you can get a serious practicing. He cared. He spent most of his life, teaching Protestants and living in Protestant land. But he did have Catholic followers. That is true. But you've got to, again, remember that the Catholic Church is like a bloody trade union. It's a job office. And there were all sorts of people who were trying to make the church look more rational. And Descartes was a way to do this. So they embraced Descartes. But initially, at least, the hostility towards Descartes from more traditionally minded Catholics was immense. They hated him. So the implication, anyway, is that society can be changed and shaped through reason. So it's not just understanding nature and overseeing nature, but our society is also something which we too may have control over. Now, to some extent, this idea goes back to Plato and the idea philosophers should be kings. Except this way of thinking, the Enlightenment thinking, is everyone is potentially a philosopher. And one of the benefits this has, well, it's nonsense, but one of the benefits this has is that it creates a culture in which everyone may think they're a philosopher. That is, in which certain generalizations about the nature of reality become commonplace. And usually you will find that you can trace the pedigree of the source of the ideas and where they come from. But people just, we copy each other. That's what people do. We're mimetic creatures. And in our copying, we may add a bit here and a bit there. But you see that the kind of ideas that are widely circulated today, you can track their philosophical pedigree. But the way most people use them, they can't put two thoughts together. So they lack the rigor that the initial philosophers had. But being rigorous doesn't mean necessarily being true. And the very problem of the nature of reason is a very, very big problem. And indeed, I would simply go so far as to say, and some post-structuralists recognize this early on before falling prey to their own quarry, so to speak. When I say post-structuralists, I'm speaking of these particularly French thinkers from the 1960s, 1970s, but they pointed out what a problem, reason's no easier to access than God. And in fact, Nietzsche had also seen that in the 19th century. I think that's absolutely true. You trying to define God, good luck. But that's why, biblical Christians or Jews or Muslims or religious people of that sort, they're not into definitions. They realize the definition is a paltry device. It simply displays, you're displaying your capacity to come up with an assemblage of principles. But what's that got to do with anything? This happened. This was a fact, according to this point of view, the religious point of view. This happened. This is why it happened. We don't understand why. It's something of a mystery. It's just God decided it would happen. So, but when you say everyone has the natural light of reason, then you start to say, well, we're going to appeal to the people. But then we're going to find one of the big issues of the French Revolution is what exactly constitutes people. It ends up being no easier than reason or God. Define the people, and you soon get a counter concept. The enemies of the people, the non-people, the people that aren't people, the reasons that aren't reasons, and so on. Also, eventually, that will come out of this is the people are good because they have reason, and the only way we can access good is through reason. But this will become even more intensely expressed by a really interesting guy called de Klootz, Anarchastus de Klootz. He was a Prussian nobleman, one of these restless, younger, head full of ideas people, traveled, ended up in France, gets attracted to the radical Jacobin wing. The Jacobins are a club. I'll talk in more detail about them. They're really important. It's an important club in a sense, the site of emergence for really important figures of the revolution. He was vehemently anti-Christian. To some extent, all the major players were really anti-Christian. Let's get that out of the way. But the de-Christianization process ends up also being an anti-deist position as well. So it's moving more radically than a number of people are willing to move, including Robespierre and his faction. He'll get caught up in that. He'll be executed, and that'll be one of the important issues in the French Revolution we'll talk to. He was also an early believer in world government, and that's really, if you believe the people are good and government is the representation of the people, then you just keep extending it, and everything will be good if all the people rule. Of course, what you can see here, dodgy, of course. What you can see here is there's a real lack of history in all this. Now, I'll come back to history in a moment in the Enlightenment, because it's obvious that, oh God, sorry about that. It's obvious that is a big deficiency, that there's really something wrong with any kind of thinking. Just one second. Any kind of thinking in which history is absent, because we're not just principles, we're people, and people live and they die, and they pass stuff across the time and so on. I'm really stuck in here. Just one second. Okay. So Klootz will be part of, as I said, the Herbertist faction. I'll talk about Jacques Devers later. So all major philosophers of the 17th century cast arguments about God in terms of nature and metaphysical terms. Deism said it was the big thing about it was ecumenical. So you had philosophers that had been born into quite different traditions. Here, Spinoza was an excommunicated Jew, but he could sign up. John Locke was an Anglican by birth. Pierre Bayle was a Calvinist. Leibniz was a Protestant and Lutheran. So you've got, all these major figures. Malebranche, Catholic. You've got them. They can come from different angles. So this is great. This is why we can have God, but we don't need war. But whole way philosophers talk about God, you can see the difference if you just open 2 pages of any reformer and 2 pages of any philosopher, and you'll see you're living in completely different worlds. As I said, the whole purpose, though, of this is really to discover the laws of nature and live by that discovery. But as I said, it does affect theology. I mentioned Malebranche. Here, I just give you this quote from Malebranche. We see things in this material world wherein our bodies dwell only because our mind, through its attention, lives in another world only because it contemplates the beauties of the archetypical intelligible world which reason contains. Now, you might believe that, and it's very beautiful, but I could just tell you, you go and find anywhere in the Bible anything that remotely resembles that kind of language. And it doesn't. I mean, it doesn't. And that's because the Bible is not written by philosophers for philosophers. It's a different group of people. There's a different social base. So it quickly moves beyond the study of nature to ethics and political institutions even. That begins with Spinoza. Spinoza, by the way, was considered to be an atheist because he had made God equal nature. Strictly speaking, pantheism, but he was considered to be an atheist. But then again, all the others were viewed with suspicion by at least by the common person. The common person who used the Book of Prayer. Leibniz, and I don't get me wrong, I love Leibniz as a philosopher, but he was called a believer in nothing. You know, Pierre Bayle gives an argument in defense of how atheists should be respectfully treated and not, which ultimately, if you're saying that, you're saying the glue that holds society together, the rituals hold it together, you can start dispensing with them. And of course, there's nothing ritualistic at all about deism. It's not ritualistic. Though, as I say that, the Freemasons will keep a ritualistic dimension to it, which explains part of their popularity. And they're a very important group. Nowhere near enough has been written upon them historically, but there are some important writings on it. And you see that a considerable number of representatives from the American Assembly, something like 30–40%, were Freemasons. George Washington was a Freemason, for example. So it is, but also essentially a secret society. I mean, all sorts of nonsense was written by them and about them, and that's, in a sense, that's part of the story. What interests me, though, is how this ecumenical kind of deism gets wide circulation amongst a particular group of people. That is a really important question. Spinoza also defended democracy. The basic reason he defends democracy is because he wants to preserve the role of the sciences and the role of philosophy. In a sense, very similar to what Plato did in wanting philosopher kings, because Plato, way back when, in ancient Greece, he had wanted to preserve the role of philosophy in the polis. And the best way to do it would be philosophers kings, or they would draft the constitution or then put into the constitution. For Spinoza, a democracy will do it best, but it's basically a constitutional one in which freedom, it's basically this idea of if we let people talk freely and be free. And of course, oh, maybe not of course, you don't know, but he was living in the Dutch Republic, which already had a degree of this, you know. So there's nothing completely surprising about this. The other thing about Spinoza was he was really the first modern to provide a biblical critique. So what a biblical critique is, he goes back, he reads the Bible, and he goes, this is what was really happening. So he exercises his understanding upon those people who've just used their imagination. So this is really a story about a lawgiver, and this is their people. They've been conquered, now they're in the desert. This is, they believe this in this miracle, but this was the real basis of this miracle. So he provides a naturalist understanding of the Book of Miracles. And you can see once Spinoza comes into play, he has a huge influence. It changes the nature of those people that are now philosophically literate, who are now moving not only from studying nature to get more control over it, not only seeing the nature of society and political society, but also this is telling you a story about, you have to ask the question, who is this? What is this church? Who are these people? What are they really doing? Let's go back to their book and let's interpret it in a way that fits the laws of nature, and we'll see these are just spreaders of superstition. And that will be the Enlightenment take on religion. They are spreaders of superstition. I'll just quickly mention another couple. John Locke is important. He investigated the nature of mind in an essay concerning human government, but he also argued for representative government and religious tolerance. So, though that wasn't by Locke extended to Catholics, Catholics were seen as a real problem. He's often considered the founder of liberalism. The idea that there should be natural government comes straight out of the Cartesian playbook, and that is people have natural reason. Because they have the natural light of reason, they are rational in a pre-social environment, and once they start talking with each other, therefore, says Locke, it's rational to have property, it's rational to converse with others to protect it. It's also rational to allow government to come in to mediate between conflict, because you can't be a judge in your own interests. He writes this after the English Revolution, but now you can't, I wouldn't say for a moment that the English Revolution happened because of philosophy, but Locke does put a philosophical interpretation of the kind of things. He doesn't specifically talk about the revolution, but the picture that he provides of natural society and political society is built from his observation of the English Revolution. Now, the Enlightenment was not just French. There were Scottish Enlightenment. Scotland was a strong centre of it. There were members of the Italian. There were Italians in it. But extended all. There was a PhD student of mine is writing about the dealing with period leading up to the Polish Enlightenment. So there's a Polish Enlightenment. There's an Enlightenment in Russia that will be very important. Largely through Catherine the Great, that will be very important. Catherine the Great corresponded, by the way, with Voltaire. That's just neither here nor there, but Voltaire, the French philosopher. So it's a very cosmopolitan kind of phenomenon. And in the main, the Enlightenment figures, the enlightened philosophers, are cosmopolitan. They basically see the whole world as being one. The fact that, people from India and China and, or indigenous people don't think remotely like these philosophers doesn't seem to have particularly worried them. And in fact, if you go back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's also an important philosopher, he has arguments with Voltaire about certain things, but he's an important philosopher. He basically goes, well, in the most, I'll use the term primitive condition, in the most primitive condition, people just basically avoid each other, and their behaviour is such it's sentimental rather than rational, but the sentiments then ultimately feed reason. So you have the sentiments and they feed into reason, and then this engagement between reason and sentiment is ultimately what he thinks will lead to a social contract and a whole new, again, he's got this great vision of a whole new world kind of order made up. His ideal type, though, is very small communal states. Actually, I won't go too far into Rousseau, simply because as soon as I start thinking about him, I realise there's so many contradictions and complexities with him. But certainly the movement from ethics to politics also meant that the philosophers were basically looking at old archaic social and political groups as just privileged, and their reasons simply justified their own existence. Their reasons weren't rational, so to be. To put it another way, they had no real reason to exist. They lacked a reason to exist. And if you didn't have a reason to exist, what the hell are you doing there? You're just taking our stuff. You're just getting in the way, and you're socially useless. And if you're socially useless, why should we keep you alive? We keep you alive on the sweat of our brow. You can see the kind of logic here. You can see from the inception, if you think it through logically, and as I said, the revolution doesn't happen as a sequence of logical inferences. But if you do think it through logically, you'll see you've got to overthrow this world. And this is exactly what people like Rousseau and Thomas Paine were calling for. Thomas Paine was a Brit that went to America and then ended up in France in the French Revolution. And he was geeing it all along until he fell in with the Gironde and then would just escape. He was very lucky he didn't get executed. New world, new Adam. That's the term of, Rousseauian term. There would be a new Adam, a new man. This idea of new man we'll also find in Marxism, a common term that appears in Marxism. Now, coming back to history, Descartes and Locke, history is not really playing any role at all. But more commonly, where it does play a role, Spinoza, Voltaire, David Hume to an important extent, though not exclusively this in David Hume, but a big part of it is superstition. Or corruption. That's Rousseau's take on history. History is a story of corruption. And then the opposite, and this is why Voltaire, who believed the opposite of Rousseau in this respect, thought things were getting better. Stage theory, that we're going from darkness into light. And Turgot, who's one of the ministers, and Condorcet, also an important player in the French Revolution, who was a representative and then secretary of the Legislative Assembly. So here we can see philosophers actively involved in this event. Turgot, minister for Louis, then disappears from the scene, but ultimately giving Louis Enlightenment advice. So it's in the air, and the monarchy cannot escape it. And people like, Louis is more old school, but Marie Antoinette, she was lapping all this shit up. And others were at court. This is what you talked about. Like a dinner party, people want to display what they know. And they get excited by displaying what they know, as well as someone confirming what they know, and then they may add a bit to each other, so they both end up with, ostensibly more of what they know, but ultimately it tends to just confirm what has brought them together. And honestly, dinner parties are really interesting. I often think the conversation is just kind of smokescreen for people feeling a kind of social bonding and conviviality. But the ideas are, they're not really, I don't think they're really important in themselves, because there's usually diabolical discussions. They're not very sophisticated discussions. But for the people in the discussions, it's really important, because a confirmation of who they are, what they think, who they believe, and they feel safe. You feel safe. I'm at the table, and you get someone at the table that says, well, I don't agree with your view of this, that, or this, especially if it's politics or religion. You've killed the dinner party. Said a dinner party killer. Anyway, other important figures. I'd mentioned Rousseau. I might come back to him. With a few things I want to say. One was Baron Montesquieu, and I mentioned him. Montesquieu is, I think, one of the most brilliant political theorists ever, and amongst these philosophers, I think he's particularly brilliant. And he sees law as the expression of the spirit. So he doesn't have a straightforward story of progress, nor a story of corruption, but he does think some things are done better, and he does think that, and if you do some things, other things will follow. He sees that the commercial prosperity of England and its liberty and its institutions are all of a piece. And he does think that England is the greatest nation on earth. So he's writing before the American Revolution, obviously. So in many ways, his work is interesting, The Spirit of Laws, because he basically smells the discontent in France, and he does two things. Well, he warns two lots. He warns the aristocracy to yield, and he warns the third estate not to be too ambitious. Because he's got the example of the English Revolution behind him. He thinks if there is a revolution, there will be a restoration. And one of the reasons he thinks that is because he understands a long history of institutions and the way division of labour has built up over time, and you can't just rip it up over time, because you'll find all sorts of people. You'll discover that there are all these dependencies that you were not conscious of. So that's now Rousseau was critical of the idea of moral progress, corruption. Basically, one simple way to formulate Rousseau is the idea that all corruption is ultimately systemic, and it is because of systemic corruption within a system, systemic corruption within a civilization. So civilization overall has been the spread of and development of the kind of power that was corrupt in its gaining. And in some way that's quite true. It's kind of true. The problem is, what do you do about it? How do you undo that? Because you could say there's a kind of transference of the idea of original sin to society itself. But then he's got this idea of the original innocence. So human is not a sinner by nature. They're not, no, they're innocent by nature. It's society. So you've created a disjuncture between society and the individual. Now, I see Rousseau everywhere today. Every time I hear someone telling me that they know what's wrong with the system, but somehow they're inoculated against the systemic, power distortions, then I see a Rousseauian. Because the Rousseauian is somehow magically apart from and not of the society, because he elevates himself or herself above it in order to judge it.
And his solutions are also, they tend to be ripped straight out of Plato's Republic.
Well, that's right. It comes straight out of, it's some kind of utopian solution which requires people of the sort that we aren't, or we've never been demonstrated to be. We can become somehow, if we just could change the social system. But the social system is only being changed by people within the social system, so they're already part of that society. How could they magically be free? And this is where there's a magic of the mind, and that is very Platonic, I think. There's a kind of magic of reason that somehow can transpose itself outside of this. I don't believe this for a second. I think this is it's certainly this kind of thinking that is being picked up and ran with by the revolutionaries, and a whole lot of them. And they celebrated Rousseau in the National Assembly. Both Montesquieu and Rousseau, as I'll point out later, you can see specific formulation of them in the early French constitutions. Ultimately, Rousseau and Montesquieu are very different in one important respect, is that Rousseau believes that social harmony can happen by the institutions being built upon moral, rational principles of the sort he has provided in the social contract, whereas Montesquieu thinks, no, it's brokering different interests, and different groups will never be able to overleap their own interests. At best, they can adapt to each other's interests. That's a very, and in fact, I think it's why I admire Montesquieu, because I think that's a genuine political thinking, and I think Rousseau is ultimately a moral thinker who wants to make politics an extension of morals. But the problem is that political thinking involves reactions over which you have no control. And having reactions over which you have no control, it means the moral bit might give you a sense of self-satisfaction in knowing you're right, but then you've got to get the police to back it up, the jails to back it up, and everyone else to back it up because you are right. And then the more you use those elements of state, or what can I say, weapons of state, then the more you will create the opposite in your enemies, those who never agreed that you're moral in the first place, who didn't agree with the laws that you said were moral, and now they just see that you're butchers and bullies. That in a nutshell is the central problem with this idea of the general will that Rousseau has. And the general will is the idea that we can imagine something which all of us would agree was the absolute good. And again, someone like Montesquieu or others would say, well, if you're a farmer, you see the good in very different terms than if you're a lawyer in the city. It's just too abstract. It doesn't get to the nub of the problem. And what you end up having, and in fact this did play itself out in the French Revolution, is a group claims to speak on behalf of the general will, but then they have to do a lot of general persecution of those people that don't live up to the general will. He was also, now this was interesting, in the main, Rousseau was very suspicious of commercial society, and we'll see in the French Revolution there's quite a bit of difference around those that are more sympathetic to the needs of commerce and those that are less so. Robespierre, complete fanatic, was very Rousseauian. Saint-Just, his psychopathic little mate, who's even more psychopathic than Robespierre. I'll talk about these characters at more length and tell you why I think this. But these characters ultimately loved Rousseau, disciples of Rousseau. He, as I said, favoured small-scale republics, very anti-aristocratic, but would ultimately be taken up by all sorts of people that didn't agree with lots of him, but bits of him, and they would especially agreed with his take on the aristocracy. The other thing about Rousseau is Rousseau was really the first author writing about the politics of the day. Let me think that. As soon as I say that, I think, I'm not sure that's quite true. Spinoza might be one, but let's just say he's an early plebeian author writing about politics, calling for social change, and he's much more proactive. He's much more than Spinoza, and because Spinoza was condemned as an atheist and also was Jew, two things going against him. Spinoza, it was kind of, you read Spinoza in secret, whereas Rousseau, who wrote operas, even though that didn't stop him condemning the theatre, he was a performer. He was a public performer, a public persona. He writes a book called The Confessions, which is all about his own frailty, and it's putting that before the whole of humankind, and it's part of this cult of sensitivity that is being built up, and it's also takes on like wildfire in the French court. And Marie Antoinette also plays with Rousseau. You will recall me saying there's a part of Versailles, I said this last week, where they all dressed up in peasant girls. It's romanticization of the agrarian life. This is all Rousseau. Rousseau romanticizes all this. Whereas the fact of the matter was it was a very hard life. Yeah, good, when there were good seasons, great. And when they weren't, great. And they weren't dentists. You know, just think of that. And then Voltaire, the young Talleyrand, who is a figure that will come up in the course of the discussion. Very interesting figure. The great survivor of the French Revolution, both him and Lafayette. Sharma's book begins with them, and it's really great because both of them, Lafayette's case, as I said, he had fought in the American Revolution, played an early, very important part in the French Revolution, only then to abscond because he would have been killed. But then comes back, there's another revolution in France in 1830, and both him and Talleyrand are alive for that. And Talleyrand plays an orchestrating part behind the scenes, whereas Lafayette is he's very old man now, a very public figure in all of this. Anyway, two figures, but Talleyrand meets the old Voltaire. Talleyrand, which is interesting because Talleyrand was a clergyman, but it tells you a lot that, you know, Voltaire's writings were all very anti-clerical. Crush the infamy. Crush the infamy. That's what he says about the church. That's really the summation. He was full of wit and repartee. He's not really a deep philosopher. He loved John Locke. He attacked the Cartesians because the Cartesian had been absorbed now largely by a number of Catholic clergy. He hated the clergy, as I said. He corresponded with Catherine the Great. He dined with Frederick the Great of Prussia, you know, so he went around the world and wrote to the world about all these great new ideas about reason, and the biggest antagonist in his imagination was the church. And here's young Talleyrand, womanizing cleric, obviously in the not because of any belief, but just for a job, of which there was a lot happening at that time in France. Just doing it for a job, and he meets with Voltaire, and that's one of the most greatest events, memorable events in his life, and he had many memorable events. So he also mocks the idea that this was the best of all possible world in a book called Candide. I just mentioned that because that's one of his more well-known ones. And along with Denis Diderot and D'Alembert and a number of others, he wrote this great big book called the Encyclopedia. And of course, we now have encyclopedias. And the whole idea was the encyclopedia was supposed to be the collection of all worldly knowledge. It's a very ambitious project. You can see it's not a very humble project, but it's a very ambitious project. That him and his mates, they knew all you needed to know, and you should have one of these in every home, and then you could get rid of that damn Bible. That was just a nuisance. That's how he thought. Okay, I'll make this the last slide for today, and I'll carry on then from here next week. So the biggest thing, and then we're going to talk about a lot about this next week, that triggers the revolution is this great financial crisis. And here you just see the problem of expenditures and revenues. And this is really going to be the problem of how do you raise, what do you do? You're in financial crisis. Now you recall me saying, and this is the last point I'll make today, you recall me saying that the combination especially of the war with England, the war against England in the French Indian Wars in America, the 7 Years' War, more broadly, and its support of the American War of Independence was a huge problem for the French. It was enormously costly. Turgot, as I had mentioned, had advised against getting involved in the war. Unfortunately, the foreign minister to Louis advised him, and Louis took his advice, advised him that this was a great opportunity to hold back British imperialism. And basically with empire, if you don't have the fight today, you'll have it tomorrow. That's your thinking. So anything that could harm England's interest, even though you're supporting an anti-monarchical cause, it's worth doing. It's worth doing. And then you know, so Louis is celebrated by the American Revolution. So this is the kind of king we want. He's one of the boys, you know. And this is great. In some ways, it increases Louis's popularity back home. And Louis had moments of high popularity. There was obviously when it all ends, it's sad and pathetic even. But you know, when this war was going on, it looked great. But the problem was, when I say they went into debt, normally they would raise taxes, but they took out all these loans, and it was the repayment of the loans that would be just impossible. So it was a never-ending sinking ship, and this is the sump, in a sense, upon which the revolution will take place. Okay, we'll call it a day, and I will carry on next week. See you, Praveen. See you.